Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today you're checking out a Stamina Sorcerer PVE build. That's right, this is a solo Stam Sorc build for the Elder Scrolls Online. And if you're looking to play a solo class in-game, especially a stamina-based class, then the Stamina Sorcerer is going to be one of the best that you can play. That's because they have very good passive healing and survivability, and some of the best AoE damage in the game. On top of that, I've fixed some of the weaknesses of the class by adding specific gear sets to add things like Major Fracture, Minor Maim that make solo play much easier. So if you're ready to go exploring some of the game's more challenging dungeons by yourself or just solo a few world bosses, then this is going to be the build for you. Let's check it out. Alright, so let's jump into the stats first on the build. Keep in mind though, as you're looking at this is a solo build primarily, okay? This is not a DPS, stamina DPS build. The stats are going to be different. When you're thinking about a solo build, you have to think about survivability, you have to think about healing, you have to think about resistances, all that stuff needs to be factored in to make sure that you actually survive and can do what you need to do, either in a dungeon or against a world boss or whatever the situation may be. So again, just keep that in mind. This is not a pure DPS build. We're talking more about solo ESO build. So looking at the stats, we have about 9k max magicka, 18k health, 32k stamina. Our recovery actually will go up a bit with a potion, so let's look at that. 17, almost 1800 stamina recovery. Health recovery is looking pretty good too. For our weapon damage, that does get buffed. So that will be 3,700, and then we do also have an infused Berserker glyph on the back bar, so you're looking at probably close to 4,200 weapon damage there once you're fully buffed. Your weapon critical is pretty solid at 54%, and then for our resistances, when we have that Hurricane buff active, we're looking at 20k spell resistance and 23k physical resistance, which is pretty good considering this is actually a medium armor build. We have all of our points here, 64 points into stamina. I am using the Artaeum Takeaway Broth as the food. This is a little bit expensive, but you do get very nice stats. It's probably the best food for this particular build. If you don't want to use this, you can always use the Dubious Cameron Throne drink, and that'll give you close to the same stats. You won't have the stamina recovery quite as high. You won't have the health recovery either. But it is a very affordable option if you don't want to purchase these, because they can get kind of pricey. For your Mundus here, I chose the Thief, and that's just to increase our weapon critical. We are running full Divines, so that does help. For the race, I went with Orc. This is just kind of my standard PvP race that I'm using in PvE right now. But Orc is actually going to be quite strong for this particular setup. You're going to get more weapon damage with the Wrathstone DLC. You're going to get healing on light attack, which is going to be very, very helpful for solo encounters. The other race that I would recommend highly, though, is also going to be the Red Guard. The Red Guard has very good cost reduction for weapon abilities. And if you know anything about the Stamina Sorcerer, most of our damage comes from weapon-based abilities. So if you're having any trouble sustaining, or if you're new to the game, definitely check out Red Guard, because that's going to help you sustain your build a lot longer with those cost reduction passives. And then really quick, the potion here is important. I am using the Essence of Weapon Crit. This actually gives a nice burst heal, so you can save that if you are needing some extra health, but it also gives us the extra weapon critical 10% boost there, which we don't get as a Stamina Sorcerer from any of our class passives. So it's very good to run for more challenging encounters. If you're just putzing around in a dungeon that's easy for you, maybe a public dungeon or something, you can just use the standard stamina trash pots. That'll work just as well. So let's jump into the gear next. My thinking on this is really, I'm using the gear on this build to kind of fill in the gaps for the Stamina Sorcerer class. Stamina Sorcerer is really good for soloing in ESO, but it's just missing a few buffs that I think are important when you compare it to classes like the Stamina Nightblade, for example. So that was kind of my approach here, is I'm using my gear to really fill in the gaps and make it more of a well-rounded build overall. So my first 5-piece set I went with is going to be the Night Mother set. This is a crafted set. Night Mother's Gaze, I believe it's 6 traits crafted. And what you're getting from this set is you're getting weapon crit, weapon damage, another weapon crit. And then on the 5-piece here, when you deal critical damage, you apply major fracture to the enemy, reducing their physical resistance by 50 to 80 for 6 seconds. So major fracture is a big deal in Elder Scrolls Online for any stamina class. This is a great debuff if you can get access to it. Unfortunately, Stamina Sorcerer does not have access to this like a class like the Nightblade would, for example. So my thinking was I want this debuff to be up all the time. And since I'm not playing with a tank and I'm not doing sword and shield, I want this debuff. So this set is a great way to get it. There's actually no cooldown, and it applies to any enemy that you hit with crit. I talked about in the intro how Stamina Sorcerer does lots of AoE damage. Any of those AoE attacks is going to possibly be a crit, and that's going to get this debuff applied to a whole bunch of enemies. So really good for just increasing your overall damage in single target or even AoE. So I like this on the solo build very much. The way I've set this up is I'm using it on one of my jewelry pieces here, the neck, and then I crafted 4 body pieces. So I've got the boots, legs, hands, and belt. Those are all divines, maximum stamina there as the enchantment. For the next 5-piece set, I went with something a little bit different here. I'm actually going with the Nightmare set. So let's check out what it does. For the 2-piece, you've got physical resistance. 3-piece, we have max health. 4-piece is weapon damage, which is great for a stamina build. And then the 5-piece is when you deal melee damage, you have a 20% chance to apply minor maim to all enemies within 8 meters for 5 seconds, and that's a damage reduction of 15%. So when I'm thinking about playing solo, I'm thinking about increasing my damage, but I'm also thinking about decreasing the damage of the encounter, basically. And minor maim is one of the best buffs for that. What's really nice about this set is it's actually an AoE minor maim, which is great because all you have to do is proc this on one enemy in a group, and then every enemy in that group is going to get the debuff, meaning the entire mob is hitting you for 15% less damage. So this is great just to up our defense, to help us take less damage overall. It's going to mean that we can survive much easier playing solo. So I think the 5-piece is great. The other bonuses are actually really good. The max health, the weapon damage, the physical resistance, all good bonuses for a solo build, stamina-based. The tricky part about this set is it is heavy armor, and it is from the Spindle Clutch dungeons, so you'll need to think about what pieces work best with this kind of setup. For me, I thought the heavy chest made the most sense, so I'm using a heavy reinforced chest on that. And then I am using 2 pieces of jewelry. Let me show you those. So this is a unnamed drop from Spindle Clutch. Spindle Clutch 2, the second version of the dungeon. The first boss drops this robust Nightmare Ring. Robust being a very good trait for Stamina Sorcerer. So if you like this set, definitely just farm that first boss, and you can get 2 of those rings. And if you farm it in vet mode, you'll get purple. So that takes care of 2 pieces. Then, like I mentioned, I have the chest, and then I have my main hand weapon, 2-hander. I have this 2-handed axe called Spindle Cleave. This is another unique drop from Spindle Clutch 1 from the final boss. She drops this 2-handed axe. I don't know. I don't think axe is really the best. Probably sword would be more helpful, even the maul. But for single target, if you're thinking about single target, world bosses and stuff, the extra bleed damage from an axe can actually be kind of nice, kind of helpful. So I did change this to Nirnhone just to get the most damage possible. And I am running an Absorb Stamina enchantment on that just for some extra sustain on the build. So Nightmare set, that is our second 5-piece set. You'll notice that this only needs to be active on the front bar. Since we are doing 2-hand and bow, our 2-hand bar is going to be the only one where we have melee damage which is actually going to proc Nightmare. So that means your back bar is open for something like the Maelstrom's Bow, if you happen to have that. With an infused trait, that would be best for this setup because you get that extra Berserker damage every 5 seconds. There should be very high uptime on that. If you don't have the Maelstrom Bow, you can put in a Bow of Agility. You'll get some nice extra stamina for a Bow of Agility in this spot. Moving on to our monster set, I went with Veladreth here, and that just kind of goes with how the build is set up to do a lot of AoE damage, a lot of cleave damage. I think Veladreth is going to be very strong for that. You can see we get some extra bonus weapon damage, which is always good. And then it just does a lot of damage on that proc every 9 seconds. Has a very high uptime on this build with all the damage that you're doing. Damage over time, AoE damage. This will basically be proccing off of cooldown. You can slot other things here. Another option that would be good is Blood Spawn. You'll get an extra bit of stamina recovery that will get you close to 30k resists if your Blood Spawn proc is active. So I think Blood Spawn would be another nice choice here. And one other option that you could actually do here, if you have access to the Master's Two-Hander, Master's Two-Hand on the front bar is going to be very strong. You could basically do a Master's Two-Handed up front, still have a Maelstrom Bow on the back bar, and then just drop your monster set. So you'd need 2 additional pieces here, probably 2 pieces of Night Mother's Gaze, and then switch your other pieces around. You could do a heavy Nightmare Chest and heavy legs, something like that. So that Master's Two-Hand, definitely think about that if you have access to that. Let's go ahead and jump into our skills here. Starting with our front bar, we've got Reverse Slice. This is our AoE Execute, deals up to 300% more damage based on missing health, and it does that AoE cleave damage, basically. So this is very strong in AoE situations against trash mobs or just clearing through dungeons. It's definitely the skill that you want, rather than Executioner for the extra AoE. Next up is Brawler. Brawler doesn't do a lot of damage. It does a nice dot, but basically the reason why we are slotting this is for the damage shield. So you can see about a 2k damage shield here, and then each enemy hit is going to basically double that. So the more enemies that are within your cleave here, the more of a shield you'll get. You can see right there. It's pretty small, but if you have 5-6 enemies, we're talking about 12k shield or more. This is not capped from what I can tell, so facing off against a full group of enemies, I'll basically have a damage shield for my entire health pool, which is really nice, just to keep you alive, basically, while your other damage over time, your AoEs, which are mostly from the back bar, basically just kill off everything around you. So definitely want this. This is what makes the build very survivable in dungeons and world boss encounters, things like that, where you have lots of enemies coming at you. Next up is Dark Deal, and I'm using this for a couple reasons. One is the stamina sustain is actually pretty nice. It gives you a nice burst of stamina. You can see 3,600 stamina back instantly. But then the change here was actually good. I think it gives you a stamina buff now that lasts 20 seconds, a stamina recovery buff. This is basically equal to about 240 stamina regen, so that's really not bad. So I like just putting this on whenever I have a moment in the fight, just to get some extra stamina back. It also has a very nice heal. You can see 8k kind of burst heal almost. This, along with our passive healing from the Sorcerer class, along with the potion that we're using, is going to mean that we have pretty good healing overall. Now, if you are not comfortable with this, because it is a little bit tricky, it does have a cast time, you can always slot in Vigor here, Resolving Vigor, just for kind of that standard heal over time. But I actually like using Dark Deal instead. I just think it's more of an interesting kind of risk-reward play style. So you can think about the heal that you want to use there. Next up is Wrecking Blow. This is just a single target spammable for those single target boss fights that we have occasionally. I do like this, other than the Dizzy Swing, more for PvE because we get a nice Empower buff. Stamina Sorcerer already has a buff to light attack, so this does makes your light attack hit even harder when you're going up against a single target, so that is nice. Next up, we've got Bound Armaments. This is just a passive ability for the most part. You can use the active effect here to get some extra block mitigation for 3 seconds. It can be nice against really hard-hitting bosses. Think about doing that. But for the most part, we're going to just be using it for the passives here. Check it out. We have an 8% max stamina boost, which is really nice. We have light attack damage increased by 11%. And the thing I always mention about this skill is because it's Daedric Summoning skill line, you get the nice Daedric Protection passive. You get an extra 20% health recovery and stamina recovery by having this ability slotted. Most of the other things here are like for Magicka Pet Sorc builds. So by slotting this, you can get that passive, which is really nice for the Stam Sorc. For our ultimate here, I went with Flawless Dawnbreaker. And 9 times out of 10, I'm not going to use this ultimate. I'm going to use the backbar ultimate instead. This is nice for clearing through trash though. But the reason why I like it is you get an extra 5% weapon damage. And then on top of that, 3% weapon damage from your Fighters Guild passive. So you're getting a total of 8% weapon damage on your front bar, which is really nice to empower those reverse slices and just to do extra damage overall. So I do like this on the front bar, and I usually go with this instead of Dawnbreaker of Smiting, which is the stun morph. Switching to our back bar, this is our bow bar, and we have Poison Injection. This is great single target damage, pretty low cost too, and it does have a nice execute effect where it gets more and more damage the lower health your target is. So you definitely want this on those big boss fights. Next up is Endless Hail. This does a lot of AoE damage. And this is one of the most important skills that we have because it just does so much damage over time. You can see about 1k physical damage every half second. Okay, the fact that it ticks every half second means we have twice as many chances to proc our healing. We have twice as many chances to proc Major Fracture from Night Mother's Gaze. And that's within an AoE. So any enemy within this AoE rain of arrows basically has a chance to get debuffed by our set. So really good damage, really good debuff from our set, and this is just a must-have. Keep it up all the time. Rearming Trap is another damage over time effect. Single target though, it does a nice bit of physical damage over time. And you can see the buff here is very nice too. Since we have fairly high crit, we get that minor force buff, which increases those crit hits by 10%. So really good just to lay down your AoEs, your Endless Hail, and then pop down your trap so that anytime you crit on those, they'll just be hitting that much harder. Our last 2 abilities here are our buffs. Now, Crit Surges, when we talk about passive healing on the Stamina Sorcerer, if you're not familiar with the class, this is your survivability. This is, it gives you Major Brutality, which is nice, right? The extra 20% weapon damage is great. That means I don't have to waste a slot for Rally. But what's really good here is that it passively heals us. Every 1 second, you can heal for 3k or more health. That's just passively every time we do damage. And since we have a pretty high crit rating, over 50%, we have lots of AoE damage. We talked about hail and all the other stuff. This should be proccing every 1 second. So very important to keep this up. If you notice that your health is dipping a little bit, check your buffs because this probably fell off. If you have this up 100% like you should, then it's going to keep your health topped off really nicely because we are, using Brawler. We have the damage shield on the front bar, and then we should have the passive healing coming from the back bar, keeping us alive. That's kind of how the build works for Stam Sorc. And then speaking about AoE damage, we also have Hurricane, which is another nice AoE damage source. It does tons of damage over time. Gives us movement speed, gives us major ward, major resolve. Great buff. You have to have this up 100% of the time. It lasts 15 seconds though, so it is a little bit tricky to keep up. Just keep in mind that, basically for every 1 crit surge, you'll need to be refreshing this 2 times just to keep that active 100%. And then for our back bar ultimate ballista here would be my first choice. This just does tons of single target damage without really having to do much. You just drop it, it fires by itself. You can go back to, spamming your brawler if you need the damage shield. You can go back to pumping out some dark deals if you need the healing, if you need the stamina back. All the while, this is just doing tons of damage to a boss or something like that. So really helpful to have this. This is, like I said earlier, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to drop this ultimate just because it does so much single target damage. So I think that covers all the skills. Let's go ahead and jump into the champion points here. Starting in our green tree, got 40 into Warlord, 29 Sprinter, 43 into Tenacity. You can do a fair bit of heavy attacks on the front bar just to get some stamina back. Keep in mind also your two-handed light and heavies do AoE damage, so it's actually kind of nice for AoE situations. 19 into Healthy, just playing off that extra boost from the Artaeum takeaway broth. 23 into Arcanist, 64 into Mooncalf, 31 into Shadow Ward, 20 into Tumbling, 43 into Blessed, 19 into Physical Weapon Expert, 51 Master at Arms, 56 into Thaumaturge. You'll get a nice boost for your damage overtime effects here. 20 Precise Strikes, 38 Piercing, 43 into Mighty. In the red tree, 66 Ironclad, 27 into Medium Armor and Spell Shield. This is just giving us a little bit extra physical and spell resistance since we are medium armor build. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, 6 medium and then 1 heavy on the chest piece. This just gives us some extra resistances, which is nice. 49 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, 37 into Thick-Skinned, and then 15 into Quick Recovery. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up for this solo Stamina Sorcerer PvE build. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, as always, make sure you smash that like button or leave a comment. It really does help me out. And think about subscribing to the channel if you're not already. I do release build videos almost every week, including more solo PvE setups, just like this one, as well as some fun and unique PvP builds. So until then, I will see you around in the next video. Thanks.